you have the most progressive political option out there going, well, you should have spent 2 years. If you had spent 2% every year for the last 25 years, we wouldn't be at this shortfall. And it's like, oh, good. Well, NATO would be really robust, but our social services would be gone. That just doesn't even come out of them anymore.
So how should we see these sort of increases in military spending, this greater posture toward, quote unquote defense? Um, it's because China and the global South are developing themselves, are undergoing, processes of economic development that pose a threat to the West, to the global North, right? For centuries, the West has actively underdeveloped the rest of the world by extracting resources, labor, and wealth from them, right? The West is only developed today because it stole from the rest of the world and, of course, indigenous peoples on this continent. That transitions quite well into, this, commitment made by Canada and all NATO members at the recent NATO summit that happened last month at the end of June, where members, committed to military spending of 5% of GDP annually, by 2035 in Canada's case. So, I mean,
That's
just to give
crazy.
it's yeah, it's insane. Just to give some context, right? The target, for the past, I think it's been several decades, is to get to 2% of GDP. All NATO members should be spending 2% of their GDP on so-called defense, military spending is better put.
Yeah.
Um, Canada has never attained that 2%, mostly because previous governments have known that, it would be suicide to do that. You'd have to cut from elsewhere, and who knows what that might trigger in terms of public reaction, um, that kind of thing. So far, I mean, I should say, so, even Stephen Harper's government is on the record saying, that that's not possible. We're not going to be able to do that. So far, I mean, I think in recent years, it's been at about 1.4 something, 1.45% of GDP. Canadian GDP is on military spending. Trudeau was pushed on this, I forget how long it was ago, several years ago, when he went to the White House to meet Trump, to bring it up to 2%. Now they're talking about 5%, and that would come to, $150 billion in military spending per year. That's what that translates to. 5% of GDP is $150 billion in military spending. Just to put that in context, I think, there was so much outcry about, a couple of years ago about, the Trudeau government purchasing the Trans Mountain pipeline. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, I might be getting this wrong, the price of the pipeline at that time was, I'm remembering it was either 4 billion or 7 billion. Either way, now today I know that, as the costs have added up, that pipeline is sits at about $34 billion. Okay, so that was outrageous
Pocket
to
change
people.
now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that was outrageous to people, rightfully so, back then. I mean, we're talking about, like what? This is four, more than four times that amount, $150 billion per year. Anyway, I could go on, but yeah, that's insane.
Well, I mean, we will let you go on. I want to go back to that 2%, um, and the fact that we hadn't met those commitments. And obviously, I'm going to work in a way to shit on the NDP. I'm sorry if you don't allow swearing on your show.
No, no, it's
um,
all good. I do.
but I had Eve Ongler on, and this was one of his sticking points, the fact that there's nobody even challenging that narrative at all. Although you say, most people are under the assumption or the knowledge that it's political suicide, no good for the economy, massive austerity would be required. That's really not what the NDP said when Carney starts talking about 5%. What did they say? They chastised the cons and the liberals for never making the 2% commitment, for failing to meet previous commitments. So it doesn't even close to challenging the concept of NATO. I don't know if we have time to unpack that. Maybe you do. Maybe you can fire through like forget like whether or not we could afford it. The whole concept of NATO is a problem, but like even if you shelf that, you have the most progressive political option out there going, well, you should have spent 2 years. If you had to spend 2% every year for the last 25 years, we wouldn't be at this shortfall. And it's like, oh, good. Well, NATO would be really robust, but our social services would be gone. That just doesn't even come out of them anymore. So that pissed me off, and I thought it was worth noting because we talk about resistance too to all of these things, and none of it is coming out of the legislature really. You talk about they undermine the conservatives by we did this first. Now you'll never be able to take credit for it, and Lord knows what your next campaign is going to ask for that we haven't given you already. But at the same time, like we don't really have anybody challenging it on the other side either. So that becomes troubling. And that 150 billion that Ashwin quoted per year is not even close to the total military spending Carney has either promised or suggested is a possibility, right? So he is giving the US, and I feel like with my kids, if I say maybe, they know it's a yes, because you don't say maybe and then say no. I feel that's mean. It's like, I'm going to just tease you with it. So my son will even be like, oh, I know that's a yes. And I'm like, damn, I buy myself some time. And that's all that it is. So when Carney says that his participation in the Golden Dome, which is think of the Iron Dome for Israel. If I have to explain that to you, you're on the wrong show, but, but for the US, and again, we're talking about Arctic sovereignty as well. This is a big protection from Russia and China, and it's going to cost billions upon billions. He says that's a possibility. We might get into that. That means he is. He's already committed to rearm Europe plan, and then you have to. He spent $6 billion before he even had the election too, right? Before he was our legitimate prime minister. I love feeding into those con points a little bit, but he spent $6 billion on like radar systems for the Arctic. So this man is just like throwing money at war, weapons, surveillance, radars, missiles. And that's your liberals. I think that's what's the most scary. Like people are like, oh, this can't be bad. It's the liberals. But like, no, that's how bad Canadian politics has gotten. These are your liberals doing this. I don't, how can we imagine what would be worse from the cons? I really don't understand. Now I'm scared. Like when the cons come in, do they feel like they've got to outdo this guy?
I'm sure.
No.
I'm sure.
We'll build the Golden Dome ourselves. We'll make it in Canada. And then that'll be at least the F-35s. That was Jagmeet's solution, right? The F-35s. No, we shouldn't be buying American F-35s. We'll build our own.
It's crazy. Yeah, no, I mean, your point about, okay, where do the conservatives then go from here? I think that's sort of the point, right? The liberals are sort of simultaneously, I mean, they're seizing on this moment to outdo their opposition, to undercut them, right? I mean, if the liberals become the conservatives and still maintain the aesthetic signifiers of what it means to be a liberal, you take away the conservatives' ammunition, right? And they have less sort of political clout to run on. In terms of the Golden Dome, I mean, how's the Iron Dome going for Israel? Did it protect Israel against missile barrages from Iran? Last I checked, you still had Israelis running into their bunkers, getting hit, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, the Golden Dome. I mean, there's too much to say there. Maybe I wanted to go.
It makes sense if you know who's there to make money off it, right?
Yeah,
like
the folks
exactly. Behind it
That's
are
right.
Peter Thiel, and he's connected to Carney, and I think we'll just have to have Ashley on to come and explain all of those connections. But it's a banker making his banker buddies a lot of money. One note that I did want to add that helps kind of make sense of some of these connections, like why are we elbows up but then giving the US military money, or the companies that make their weapons money. And Carney spent a lot of his time convincing Canadian pensions to heavily invest in the US weapons manufacturing industry. And so, yes, although that is good for the Canadian economy because our pensions are well funded because they're war hawks and they're always at war, obviously we understand the problem with that, right? So again, a banker with bankers' interests, we don't know what he's invested in. Pierre always has me feeding into his lines like that, like, but it's true, right? Like he has fiscal interests that aren't yours, that won't make sense, like, or to your parents, like they're like, why would they do that? Right? Like, why would they do that? That can't be good for us. I'm like, no, but they don't act in your best interest, right? Like, I don't know, most people listening probably realize that, but I know you're talking to people that were like, well, that just doesn't make any sense, like, why would Carney do that? And there's lots of reasons.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
mean, the whole Golden Dome thing. I mean, you're so right. This is I think this was sort of pitched by Lockheed Martin, right? The Golden Dome idea. I mean, people talk about Indians and Nigerians as being scammers, right? Known for scams, online scams, phone scams. The biggest scam is Western civilization. You have these people just, it's making up things left, right, and center. It doesn't matter if you have the Atlantic Ocean on one side of your protected continental island and the Pacific Ocean on the other side. You need a Golden Dome because we need to make money off of it. Trust me, guys, just trust me. It's crazy.
it sounds cool, right? Like people get sold on it.
Yeah,
Ooh, but yeah, you build up that environment of fear too, where we're constantly looking at each other sideways. That feeds into folks thinking that's justified. The whole Arctic threat, though, they've been playing on that for quite some time, being able to spend a lot of money up there, trying to protect it. Meanwhile, not even going into discussions, legitimate discussions on indigenous sovereignty up there. That's always going to be that contradiction. But that Russia red baiting China constant threat, no matter what, right, has us obviously looking in the wrong directions. Not to be a Putin stand, but I mean, it just has us not looking at capital
yeah,
as the
that's right.
real threat first and foremost. It's always got to, like, it's external, and that makes us come together as a family, as a nation. Yay. When there's an external threat, an other, and they just can't decide who that other is the United States. Sometimes it's Russia, sometimes it's China. It's never Israel.
Yeah. I mean, so I mean, we've looked at, well, how sort of insane of a plan this is to get to 5% of GDP on military spending. Let's maybe, uncover a little bit like why is this happening? Again, coming back to this thing about the paradigm shift, right? You have NATO commitment spending 5% on GDP. Canada has to spend 5% of GDP on military spending. You have maybe the Golden Dome. I'd be surprised if it happens, but that you have Canada joining hands with Europe, signing strategic partnership agreements in terms of defense, this kind of thing. What explains this? What is happening? You mentioned Russia and China. I mean, in Canada, that's used as the excuse to expand northward, to recolonize the north. Turn our military attention to the north. Um, that as if Russia would ever pose a threat to Canada and the United States. Um, these are not Russia and China are not military threats to the West. This is sort of a NATO talking point, right? As if NATO is a defensive organization. That's the assumption in this, right? NATO is a defensive organization. Russia and China are, aggressors. Every as many have learned during, the genocide and Israel's behavior, in the whole region. What is it? Every confession isn't no every every accusation is an admission or a confession, right? NATO here is the one that's the offensive organization. It is not a defensive organization. If it was a defensive organization, it would have disbanded when the Soviet Union collapsed. Okay, I mean that's now they're talking about forming an Asian NATO, heading eastward to encircle China. Anyway, Russia,
Anyway, that's just a
Russia.
side note for now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there would be a lot to say on that. But Russia and China are not military threats to Canada and the US. And when we talk about military threats to Canada, we're largely you know, that's the question of threatening the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is, if Canada is attacked in any kind of way, the U.S. steps in. I mean, no matter how much antagonism Carney and Trump pretend to have against each other. But Russia and China, and especially China, are economic threats to the West and to Canada, and uh, so how should we see these sort of increases in military spending, this greater posture toward, quote unquote defense? Um, it's because China and the global South are developing themselves, are undergoing, processes of economic development that pose a threat to the West, to the global North, right? For centuries, the West has actively underdeveloped the rest of the world by extracting resources, labor, and wealth from them, right? The West is only developed today because it stole from the rest of the world and, of course, indigenous peoples on this continent. Again, coming back to the point about how Western civilization is really a scam. I mean, they steal from you and ask you why you're so poor, why you're underdeveloped. If you're indigenous, why are you so lazy? Yeah, a lot to say there. Um, but now that they're finally being challenged on the economic terrain, right? China, especially on the part of the global South, is really redirecting its wealth not outward toward the global North and to the West, but reinvesting that wealth, into its own country, uh, to pursue economic development. And if you look at any Chinese city, you can see that this is true. Um, this threatens the West, and if the West can't economically compete, which it won't, right? Because that involves cutting into their profits, that involves potentially, reinvesting in research and development. They don't want to do that.
Heaven
Reinvesting
forbid.
in their people, yeah, heaven forbid. They don't want to do that. What they're good at, what they've been good at, is violence, is military coercion, and it also so happens that the war economy is profitable. So naturally the easiest thing to do is to pour more money into the military, into so-called defense, to be offensive and to act as to act to deter these powers. I think in an article that I was reading, it was exactly those words that Mark Carney had used at the at the NATO summit, to in describing these spending increases, that these increase these increases in spending will act as deterrents against so-called aggressors, Russia and China. Um, yeah, I mean,
Aggressors.
yeah, there you go. I mean, so that's really what explains this. I mean, I should maybe shout out the hyper imperialism dossier that was put out by the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. I mean, this is really, they've looked into this, they've looked into the numbers. A lot of this is their argument about how um, when the West cannot compete economically with China, what do you turn to? You turn to military solutions. And if you look at the history of the West, that's essentially what it is. You lead with military coercion, with violent coercion, and then you economically subordinate the other. They did that on this continent in North America. They have been doing that around the world through colonialism, neocolonialism, etc.
It's a scary thought to think like that that's what's motivating folks to spend, our tax dollars on, especially when we won't benefit from that competitive edge all that much. You know what I mean? Like, and all these solutions are always just an attack on somebody else's working class, right? Rather than a lot of the solutions, even that we suggested in response to the tariffs down south, too, were just like damaging to workers down there, and uh, always lacked this class analysis on it, on what these bills mean, and our reaction. But like hearing you call China, I know you're being facetious, obviously, the aggressor, while Trump talks about taking us over. And I just wonder who that's selling with. Who is buying those lines? Like, I'm appreciative Ashwin's able to kind of explain why, because there's people going like, why? None of this makes sense. Because I think they don't see Russia as an aggressor. Not to them. I mean, maybe to Ukraine. I can get people looking at that. But China, I think that's becoming harder and harder for people to do, especially with the exposure that we can get now from China and seeing how they live and, what we've naturally been told. So it's easier to see them as that economic threat as opposed to a military one. But it's it's just, I think, again, drives home that point that Carney is really playing into US hegemony and US capital needs. And that goes the same with his foreign policy that we've seen him take in a very short time, like 3 months, 3+ months. He's been there and he's given us every reason to believe he's going to be a war hawk himself or green light any kind of military intervention abroad.